Ellen White and Racism, Part 2. In Testimonies, Volume 9, published in 1909, Ellen White made the following statements. The colored people should not urge that they be placed on an equality with white people. That's page 214. We cannot expect that they, that is the colored people, will be as firm and clear in their ideas of morality. That's page 223. No one is capable of clearly defining the proper position of the colored people. Page 213. And finally, the work of proclaiming the truth for this time is not to be hindered by an effort to adjust the position of the Negro race. Page 214. These statements are quite controversial, especially in our contemporary 21st century world. Critics of Ellen White exploit these statements and say, here is evidence that Ellen White was without question a racist. These are racist statements, and there's no other way that you can interpret these statements other than pure racist sentiments. And even supporters of Ellen White sometimes wonder exactly what was going on when she made these statements. They definitely require attention.
Welcome to the Ellen White Podcast. Here is your host, Dr. Jud Lake.
Hello, friends, and welcome back to the Ellen White Podcast. It's been a while. I've had some issues taking care of my mother. She had a great illness, and we have got her taken care of in a place where she will be well. But that took me some time, and so I'm just catching up now. But for those, of course, who are listening sometime later, you won't notice the gap. But those who have been keeping up, there has been a gap. So now I want to continue with this series on Ellen White and racism. We're not plunging in depth into everything, but we're hitting just some of the main issues. And these statements I just read, those are highly controversial. Critics make Ellen White out to be a racist by citing these statements without their context. Context is everything. The literary context, the historical context. I've heard critics on YouTube channels and writings, websites take these statements and continually set them forth as an example of Ellen White's racism, they say. But never do they set these statements in their context in Testimonies, Volume 9, nor do they even give any consideration whatsoever to the historical setting in which they were made, in the larger context of American history at the time, as well as what was happening with the Adventists working in the South at the time. So we need to explore those issues and discuss them. So first of all, let's look at the overall context. This is in Testimonies, Volume 9. It was published in 1909, the last testimony book of the 9-volume series. If you look in the table of contents, you'll see that this is section 6. It's among the colored people, and there were several different sections in there. First of all, you'll notice the main division section is a call for colored laborers. And then the next major section is proclaiming the truth, where there is race antagonism. That has several subdivisions. Then you have this subdivision, or the main section, I should say, the color line. And that's where most of these controversial statements are found. And then you have, finally, the consideration for colored laborers and the needs of a mission field. So those are the main divisions in which Ellen White addresses this topic of working among the colored people. So it's a large section, and there are other places where she's written a lot about that. A very important book entitled The Southern Work is a compilation of her Review and Herald articles, some of her main essays and manuscripts during this period, really from 1891 up until 1908. Her statements dealing with how to minister to the Black people in the South, how to deal with the racial challenges that they were having. So all of this material needs to be considered in interpreting these controversial statements. Now, it's important to understand that this section in Testimonies, Volume 9, Section 6, Among the Colored People, it is actually previous councils that are patched together and placed here from the Southern work, from Testimonies, Volume 7, where she also addresses the Southern work. They're compiled from that, earlier letters that are written during this time. Really, the date of this whole section is from the years 1895 to 1909. And understanding this period is crucial to understanding what Ellen White is doing and what she is saying, what is going on in the South at the time, and what is going on with the workers in the Adventist workers in the South at the time. So to set this up, let's look at the larger literary context first. We're going to analyze very carefully with the literary context and the historical context that is so often ignored in interpreting these statements. So what I have found is guiding principles that Ellen White presents. And basically, two guiding principles are found in her writings that help us understand what's going on behind these statements. So principle number one, this is derived from Manuscript 7, 1896. And so she writes there, how little of the Spirit of Christ has been manifested in the treatment given to the colored race in this so-called Christian country. The Negro's color, the features that tell of his African descent, are a badge of humiliation to the whole race because of the prejudice of the white people against them. Please note carefully how she writes this. Ellen White repeatedly spoke against prejudice, against racism, against caste. She went on to say, they are often treated as if it were a disgrace to sit by their side or even to worship in the same congregation. It is a shame for Christians who profess to be themselves redeemed by the blood of the Lamb to take a position to make these men feel that the mark of a humiliated race is upon them. Men standing in God's broad sunlight with mind and soul like other men, with as goodly a frame as has the best developed white man. What a significant statement. Here she is showing the divine equality, that is, in terms of creation, the equality between the white people and the Black people. That is very clear what she's doing. And actually, in another place, to just go right along with this, a significant statement in Testimonies, Volume 7, published about the same period. This is page 223. She says, the Lord has looked with sadness upon that most pitiful of all sights, the colored race in slavery. He desires us in our work for them to remember their providential deliverance from slavery, their common relationship to us by creation and by redemption, and their right to the blessings of freedom. So these are very clear statements about the equality of whites and blacks in creation and in redemption. And that is a theme that runs through all of Ellen White's writings. So back to this manuscript 7 that I was quoting here. She writes, let us as Christians who accept the principle that all men, white and black, are free and equal, adhere to this principle and not be cowards in the face of the world and in the face of the heavenly intelligences. We should treat the colored man just as respectfully as we would treat the white man. Here is a principle. Notice she says, let us as Christians accept the principle that all men, white and black, are free and equal. This is a fundamental, foundational principle that runs through all of Ellen White's writings about race, about the black people and the white people. All are free and equal. So this principle permeates these writings. And remember, in the pre-Civil War years, this woman had told Adventists to defy the revived and strengthened fugitive slave law in the 1850s. And here she says we should adhere to this principle and not be cowards in the face of the world. And this would seem to be contradicted in some of the statements that I just read. But we must understand these are principles that actually are guiding those statements, as I will show. The circumstances, the historical circumstances, are the key in understanding these statements. So that's principle one. All human beings are free and equal by creation and by redemption. That's principle number one. Principle two, this is from manuscript 22A. This is an interview Ellen White had with church leaders on November 20, 1895. So this is just a year prior to the previous statement that gives the principle of all humans are equal, white and black. She wrote, or she said in this interview, "The time has not yet come to be defiant and go right along as if there was no prejudice. Be wise as serpents and harmless as doves. If you see that if you do certain things which you have a perfect right to do, that you cannot work with human minds, you should refrain from doing that which will close their minds against the truth. There is no use of our cutting our own heads off. There is a world to warn. All things are lawful, but all things are not expedient." Now, this statement, with some slight editing, made its way into the essay in Testimonies, Volume 9. I'll come to it again a little later, but I want to address it here briefly. The time has not come for us to work as if there were no prejudice. Christ said, "Be ye therefore wise as serpents and harmless as doves." Matthew 10:16. If you see that you are doing certain things which you have a perfect right to do, you hinder the advancement of God's work, refrain from doing those things. Do nothing that will close the minds of others against the truth. There is a world to save, and shall gain nothing by cutting loose from those we are trying to help. All things may be lawful, but all things are not expedient. Notice she has edited the earlier statement and refined it for this setting in Testimonies, Volume 9, where it is first published. She went on to say, "The wise course is the best." This is page 215 in Testimonies, Volume 9. "As laborers together with God, we are to work in the way that will enable us to accomplish the most for Him. Let none go to extremes. We need wisdom from above, for we have a difficult problem to solve. If rash moves are made now, great mischief will be done." So a different time and a different set of circumstances in which defiance of racial prejudice would produce hindrance to the gospel work and loss of life, both Adventist whites and many blacks, that is the setting she is addressing. And the verse that she is actually citing is 1 Corinthians 6:12. Scholars differ in the exact meaning of this verse, and I will not get into that here. The basic idea in the text and the way Ellen White uses it is this, as one commentator put it: "An action which is right in itself could in some circumstances be wrong." In other words, it is right to stand against prejudice, but in some cases, some circumstances, it could be a bad thing. It could be wrong. It could cause loss of life. It could cause all kinds of problems in the setting in which she was addressing. And that will become clear as this episode unfolds. So both of these guiding principles can be seen in the context of Section 6 in Testimonies, Volume 9. And before we examine the literary context of this essay, we need to understand the larger historical setting of this period in American history, and then the immediate context of the Adventists working in the South. So let's look at that larger setting in American history. So we want to just briefly go back to the situation in the South immediately following the war. Now, I've written a book on the Civil War, A Nation in God's Hands, Ellen White and the Civil War. And I basically ended that book at the end of the Civil War. But a lot happened after the war. What is known in American history as Reconstruction, reconstructing the South and putting the nation back together after the devastation of the war. But during this time, the South was managed very carefully by the North. Soldiers were down there. It was a very volatile situation. Southerners reacted strongly to the freedom of all of the black people. And they all were really didn't know what to do. The black people didn't know what to do. The white people didn't know what to do. And so, just to hit some of the highlights, black codes were instituted from 1865 to 1866. This restricted the rights of black Americans. So what we find is immediately after slavery, while they were free, they were put into all these restrictions. And that was just the beginning. So black codes restricted the rights of Americans. During this time, secret societies developed. One of the most well-known is the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, a terrorist organization. It launched a reign of terror. During the years 1868 to 1871, you have the KKK lynchings of blacks as well as whites. But they eventually had hearings on this. And in 1872, there was a temporary peace. And I'm just sketching over this period. Books have been written about the Reconstruction. Very important period in American history, resolving things after the war. And in a sense, it did not resolve the issues of racism. And then in 1877, you had the official end of Reconstruction by a compromise. And they'll say a little more about that in a moment. So that's a thumbnail sketch of the years following Reconstruction. It was not the best time for blacks, yet it was a better time than what they had had. And it would get worse. So in a sense, that was probably the best time for them, if you can call that even a good time for the poor black people that were trying to just figure things out after slavery. So what happens at the end of Reconstruction, we have the beginning of what is known in history, American history, sadly known as Jim Crow. What is Jim Crow? Well, Jim Crow refers to a system of laws, policies, and practices that enforced racial segregation and discrimination against African Americans, primarily in the southern United States, but also in other parts of the country, from the late 19th century until the mid-20th century. The term Jim Crow originated from a minstrel show character portrayed by Thomas Dartmouth Rice in the early 1830s, a white actor who performed in blackface and caricatured African Americans. Over time, the name came to symbolize the legal and social system of enforced racial discrimination and segregation. So the period we're talking about in which Ellen White made these statements is a part of this Jim Crow era. All right, these systems of laws and policies and practices enforcing racial segregation and discrimination against African Americans. There are two basic phases to this. Phase one is the years 1878 to 1896. Now, I'm drawing from two excellent books, history books that cover this period. And I'm just going to be citing various paragraphs from them because I think they summarize it admirably about what was going on during this time. First is the book by Gerald M. Packard, published in 2003, American Nightmare, an appropriate title, American Nightmare, The History of Jim Crow. Another book more recently, published in 2020, by Henry Louis Gates Jr., Stony the Road, Reconstruction, White Supremacy, and the Rise of Jim Crow. Both of these books are excellent resources for understanding this dark period in American history. So let me cite, first of all, from Packard's book, American Nightmare. For African Americans, the end of Reconstruction represented a catastrophe of incalculable magnitude. In the wake of Reconstruction's collapse, blacks, as a disfranchised class, ever more trapped in economic peonage, found that only negligible barriers remain to block racism's spread. With blacks written out of the system, few white voices in either the South or the nation as a whole would speak forcefully for their civil rights. And that's from Packard American Nightmare, page 62. Now, the white South was once more free to deal with the black in its own way, just as it had before 1861. The African American was about to feel the built up rage of ordinary whites who had watched relatively silently as Reconstruction had played out. A newly resurgent Democratic Party brought with it a white counter revolution known as the Southern Redemption. Such an ironic movement, an ironic title, Southern Redemption. A movement, and that is my comments there, again from the book, a movement whose unapologetic and frankly stated goal was the permanent return of the black man as nearly as possible to his pre-war status. Now, another book, which I'm not going to cite from, but is excellent in dealing with this period, the title is most provocative, most accurate. It's by Douglas A. Blackman. The title of this book is Slavery by Another Name: The Re-Enslavement of Black Americans from the Civil War to World War II. An excellent book, worth studying with regard to this period. Again, citing American Nightmare. It wasn't, of course, apparent or understood at the time, but what the 1877 White House Compromise, the event that effectively ended the post-Civil War Reconstruction era, meant was that the South was going to be allowed to go its own way. Since whites controlled its economy, its police power, and its voice in the national legislature, its own way meant whatever whites wanted. And what white Southerners wanted most was as curtailed a state of citizenship as they could create for those men and women who had been their slaves. The white people of the South abhorred any notion of sharing the ballot, of sharing their social institutions or schools, of sharing their primacy by being with black creatures they had held to be virtually another species. They were not only ready but eager to do whatever it took to keep African Americans permanently and unmistakably in legal and social subjugation. They would use their economic power, their education, their ballot, and if necessary, their access to violence and legal police power and extra-legal Ku Klux Klan power to achieve these ends. That's American Nightmare, page 64. Now, Gates, in his book Stony the Road, describes the attitude in the South in 1866. The post-war American South fashioned a political and economic system in which freed people were, if no longer slaves, then not fully free either. Suspended in a liminal state somewhere between enslavement and quasi-citizenship, as close as a person can be to being a slave without being legally defined as such. He went on to say, on October 1, 1866, Benjamin Franklin Perry, the provisional governor of South Carolina, wrote about the freed people in the Charleston Daily Courier. And here's a quote: "The African has been in all ages a savage or a slave. God created him inferior to the white man in form, color, and intellect, and no legislation or culture can make him his equal. You might as well expect to make the fox the equal of the lion in courage and strength, or the ass the equal of the horse in symmetry and fleetness. His color is black. His head is covered with wool instead of hair. His form and features will not compete with the Caucasian race, and it is vain to think of elevating him to the dignity of the white man. God created differences between the two races, and nothing can make him equal." That's quoted in the Stony the Road, page 67. What a pathetic attitude, but that is history. That is how whites viewed the blacks in this post-war era at the turn of the century. That is the situation that Ellen White was addressing. But let's continue. In his collection of writings, Race Orthodoxy in the South and Other Aspects of the Negro Question, 1914, racist and Southern educator Thomas Pierce Bailey wrote, "Here is the racial creed of the Southern people as expressed by a group of representative Southerners during the past few months." Now, This is in 1914. This reflects the attitude that had been there for years. Here are these statements. Here is what they considered to be their racial creed of the Southern people. Blood will tell. The white race must dominate. The Teutonic people stand for race purity. The Negro is inferior and will remain so. This is a white man's country. No social equality, no political equality. In matters of civil rights and legal adjustments, give the white man as opposed to the colored man the benefit of the doubt, and under no circumstances interfere with the prestige of the white race. In educational policy, let the Negro have the crumbs that fall from the white man's table. Let there be such industrial education of the Negro as will best fit him to serve the white man. Only Southerners understand the Negro question. Let the South settle the Negro question. The status of peasantry is all the Negro may hope for, if the races are to live together in peace. Let the lowest white man count for more than the highest Negro. The above statements indicate the leadings of Providence. So in many ways, they were just like sadly, just like the attitudes of whites prior to the Civil War. They claimed that God was on their side and God was leading them and God's providence was in their favor. Historian C. Van Woodward believed Bailey's essay, quote, set down this racial creed of the Southern people with such candor and accuracy that it may serve as the best available summary, end quote. That's from his book, Origins of the New South, published in 1951, page 355. After discussing the scientific theories and political themes over the years in the South before and after the Civil War, distinguished historian Henry Louis Gates, in his book we've been citing, Stony the Road, it's page 80 in the Kindle, he said, through the intertwining and overlapping of themes over decades across genres and disciplines, we can begin to see how the patchwork of white supremacy was knitted into the suffocating blanket of Jim Crow, unfolding after decades of bad racial science and political debates about causes of and solutions to the so-called Negro problem. So that's phase one. Phase two began in 1896 and went up until the mid-1960s when, thank goodness, Jim Crow was brought to its demise. That's, of course, another story. This leads us to discuss a major legal case, Plessy versus Ferguson, in 1896. And this would make a significant difference in what people in the South would experience, especially the poor black people. The Plessy versus Ferguson case was a landmark decision by the United States Supreme Court in 1896. It upheld the constitutionality of racial segregation laws for public facilities as long as the segregated facilities were equal in quality, a doctrine that came to be known as separate but equal. The case arose from an 1892 incident in which Homer Plessy, a man of mixed race, refused to sit in a Jim Crow car, that is a segregated railway car for blacks, in Louisiana, challenging the state law that mandated racial segregation on public trains. Plessy's challenge was rooted in the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution, which guarantees equal protection of laws to all citizens. However, the Supreme Court ruled against Plessy, arguing that segregated public facilities did not violate the 14th Amendment as long as they were equal in quality. The decision provided a broad legal basis for the spread of racial segregation and discrimination in the United States through Jim Crow laws. The Plessy versus Ferguson case legitimized the system of segregation and discrimination against African Americans and other racial groups, leading to profound social and legal consequences. It was not until 1954 in the Brown versus Board Education of Topeka case that the Supreme Court overturned the separate but equal doctrine, marking the beginning of the end for legalized racial segregation in the United States. From the end of Reconstruction until the Supreme Court Plessy versus Ferguson decision in 1896, Jim Crow spread like a pestilence. The virus settled in community after community, and county after county, and state after state, until its cells had taken over the entire body of the South, from a hazy and undocumented existence as simply custom until it was armored in the full force of statutory law. Jim Crow became what it meant to be Southern. All of that is a citation from Packard's American Nightmare, page 65. Continuing, drowned in a flood of Jim Crow, mostly still technically just customary, but the statutory kind was beginning to seep out of the South's legislative chambers. Black Southerners were left virtually alone to face their torment as the end of the 19th century approached. The phase that perhaps best articulates white America's regard for its 10 million blacks a century ago is a moral abandonment. With the abolition of slavery, the American black had become, in the words of Russell Nye, no longer a problem in morality, but a problem in politics. The concerns of Northern abolitionists had largely evaporated by the 1890s, and the entire nation seemed content to regard African Americans precisely as Southern racists urged, as a hopelessly inferior underclass and whose direction was best left to the Southern's lead. And then came Plessy. The century closed with a decision that bestowed the blessing of the nation's highest court on Jim Crow. A case that had begun in Louisiana in 1892 took 4 years to snake its way along the serpentine legal road leading to the Supreme Court and ended in what can reasonably be judged the most catastrophic decision in American judicial history. That is again from Packard, American Nightmare, page 73. The Plessy decision did not create Jim Crow, nor was it responsible for its spread across the South. That had happened in the 30 years before Homer Plessy had his day in court, but it legitimized Jim Crow in law. For after another 6 decades, the vast majority of the nation's blacks would be forced to endure this American nightmare. The Plessy decision struck an almost fatal blow to what was left of 19th century black aspirations for equality and for assimilation into America's vaunted melting pot. As the 20th century progressed, the disgracefulness of Jim Crow would be chipped away at by thousands of people, black and white, in and out of the courts and state houses and in acts of civil disobedience. Not a few of these persons would pay their efforts with their lives, but the long night was still in its early hours as the new century approached, and the damage would be deep and the horrors many. Again, Packard, American Nightmare, page 78 through 79. This book is extremely important in describing this period and well worth buying and reading. These early hours of the long dark night the author refers to is the precise historical context in which Ellen White penned her words that we are discussing. And this leads me to discuss the violence of this period expressed in the horrible practice of lynching. Actually, it's the crime of lynching, but in the South, it was not considered a crime. Now, Ellen White made a couple of references to lynchings, although she didn't use the term. In 1891, in her watershed message, Our Duty to the Colored People, she stated, the same spirit that held the colored people in slavery is not dead, but alive today, ready to spring into activity. The same spirit of oppression is still cherished in the minds of many of the white people of the South, and will reveal itself in cruel deeds, which are the manifestation of their religious zeal. That's a Southern work. It was published in 1898 or written in 1908, stated, or I should say, this is a Southern work published in 1898, page 67. Also, in manuscript releases, page 15, she wrote, the colored people have had before them the example of commonness and adultery. These evils are all through our world. But when the poor, wretched, ignorant race, who know scarcely anything of purity and righteousness, do commit sin, sin that committed by white people is scarcely condemned. Colored people are tortured to death, whether proved guilty or not. So in other words, she is saying that she is accurately depicting the situation that colored people were often accused of crimes they hadn't committed, and it was never proved whether they did it or not. Some obviously must have done it, but apparently a number of them did not commit it, but they were never tried, and they were lynched because of that and died a horrible death, which I'm about to describe. So she's probably referring to this cruel treatment in the lynchings rather. Franklin Morton, in his 30 years of lynching in the United States, 1889 to 1919, concluded that during the 30 years between 1889 and 1918, a total of 3,224 black people were lynched by angry white mobs. Of this number, 61 were women. Now, there's been a lot of scholarship in recent years on lynchings, and that number has changed, but that's about the approximate number. In other words, there were a lot of poor black people lynched, including women, but also whites were lynched in the years following Reconstruction, as well as during this period as well. And sometimes they were lynched for terrible crimes, exceptionally bad crimes that they may have committed, but a lot of it was also because they sympathized with the blacks and maybe were too close to them in various ways. Now, I want to cite some primary sources and summaries of primary sources, and I'm going to start with Leon F. Litwack, a scholar who has captured very well for us in his various writings the experience of the black people during the Civil War and afterward. And in this book, Trouble in Mind, he gives some vivid depictions, horrible depictions of lynchings. And he describes it, and he's pulling from primary sources and does an excellent job summarizing it. And so I want to get into this, and I'm going to cite some descriptions of lynchings for you. And I need to let you know before I get into this, this section is rated R. This is graphic. This is most unpleasant, most uncomfortable to read or hear. But I believe we need to understand the horror of violence that took place during this time. And I'm citing Litwack here in page 281. Before saturating hose with oil, and now as a background, they've taken him to they've lynched him, a huge mob, and they put him to the stake here. And here's what happens. Before saturating hose with oil and applying the torch, they cut off his ears, fingers, and genitals and skinned his face. While some in the crowd plunged knives into the victim's flesh, others watched with unfeigned satisfaction the contortions of Sam Hose's body as the flames rose, distorting his features, causing his eyes to bulge out of their sockets and rupturing his veins. When in Ho's agony, he almost managed to unloosen his bonds, the executioners quenched the flames and retied him and applied more oil to the body before relighting the fire. Such suffering, reported one newspaper, has seldom been witnessed. The only sounds that came from the victim's lips, even as his blood sizzled in the fire, were, "Oh my God, oh Jesus." Before Hose's body had even cooled, his heart and liver were removed and cut into several pieces, and his bones were crushed into small pieces. The crowd fought over these souvenirs, and the more fortunate possessors, and that's in quotes, made some handsome profits on the sales. Some pieces of bones went for 25 cents, and a piece of the liver, crisply cooked, sold for 10 cents. Shortly after the lynching, one of the participants reportedly left for the state capitol, hoping to deliver to the governor of Georgia a slice of Sam Hose's heart. Now, of course, Sam Hose was a black man, and this lynching mob was all white. It's horrible. It's disgusting. It's outrageous. But it's history. It happened. There's numerous testimonies of these lynchings. I'm just going to pull from a few of the many, many eyewitness testimonies to these lynchings. But Litwack, on page 285, helps us really understand the situation, this context. The quality of the violence meted out to blacks after emancipation and during Reconstruction included mob executions designed to emphasize the limits of black freedom, anticipated to a considerable degree the wave of murder and terrorism that would sweep across the South 2 decades later and become, by the turn of the century, one of its unmistakable trademarks. There was another colored man lynched, a South Carolinian noted in his diary on September 28, 1893. They say for having murdered a white man. I tell of these lynchings so that if this diary ever comes to light in after years, one may see the brutal and unsettled state of the South. That's a good way to put it. The brutal and unsettled state of the South. This is the context of the writings of Ellen White we're discussing here. Litwack continues. What was strikingly new and different in the late 19th and early 20th centuries was the sadism and exhibitionism that characterized white violence. The ordinary modes of execution and punishment were deemed insufficient. They no longer satisfied the emotional appetite of the crowd. To kill the victim was not enough. The execution needed to be turned into a public ritual, a collective experience, and the victim needed to be subjected to extraordinary torture and mutilation. What had been in the past a usually rapid dispatch of the victim, which I will add often took place in hangings, now became part of a voyeuristic spectacle prolonged as long as possible, once even for 7 hours, for the benefit of the crowd. Nor were whites content after the victim had died. In some instances, they continued to pump bullets into the body, after which they carved it up with knives or burned it to a crisp, and they might permit the body to dangle by the rope for the next several days as a warning to the black community. The story of a lynching, then, is more than the simple fate of a black man or woman hanged by the neck. It is the story of slow, methodical, sadistic, often highly inventive forms of torture and mutilation. If executed by fire, it is the red-hot poker applied to the eyes and genitals, and the stench of the burning flesh as the body slowly roasts over the flames and the blood sizzles in the heat. If executed by hanging, it is the convulsive movement of the limbs. Whether by fire or rope, it is the dismemberment and distribution of severed body parts or bodily parts as favors and souvenirs to participants and the crowd. Teeth, ears, toes, fingers, nails, kneecaps, bits of charred skin and bones. Such human trophies might reappear as watch fobs or be displayed conspicuously for public viewing. Obviously, this is barbaric, horrible. But this is what was happening. On page 287, Litwack writes, the mob execution of a black man, woman, or family was not only a public spectacle, but also a public theater, often a festive affair, a participatory ritual of torture and death that many whites preferred to witness rather than read about. Newspapers on a number of occasions announced in advance the time and place of a lynching with such colorful headlines as Negro Jerky and Sullen as Burning Hour Nears. Special excursion trains transported spectators to the scene, employers sometimes released their workers to attend. Parents sent notes to school asking teachers to excuse their children for the event, and entire families attended, the children hoisted on their parents' shoulders to miss none of the action and accompanying festivities. Little separated mob lynchings from public executions, neither the rapidity of the justice rendered nor the festive mood that often prevailed. Some ladies were present, a local newspaper said of one such execution attended by 3,000 people from all parts of the Rankin County, Mississippi in 1909. A few were nursing infants who tugged at the mother's breast while the mother kept her eyes on the gallows. She didn't want to lose any part of the program she had come miles to see and to tell the neighbors at home, end quote. That's 1909, the year Ellen White published Testimonies, Volume 9. Again, very much a part of the historical context. Well, that's horrible enough. I want to read to you or share with you a couple of others from another source. And these are testimonies from Scott Nearing's book, Black America, published in 1929. He lists some newspaper um, depictions of lynchings. I know I'm dwelling a lot on this. You may want me to move on, but I just believe it's important to get a feel for the danger and the violence of this period of white on black, because I believe it clarifies the sentiments behind Ellen White's statements that we will look at here in a little bit. Now, this jumps right into a newspaper depiction of a horrible torture of a black man, and this black man was brave during this horrible death. This is the Memphis Press. More than 500 persons stood by and looked on while the Negro was slowly burned to a crisp. A few women were scattered among the crowd of Arkansas planters who directed the gruesome work of avenging the death of O.T. Craig and his daughter, Mrs. C.O. Williamson. This individual was accused of murder. Not once did the slayer beg for mercy, despite the fact that he suffered one of the most horrible deaths imaginable. With the Negro chained to a log, members of the mob placed a small pile of leaves around his feet. Gasoline was then poured on the leaves, and carrying out of the death sentence was underway. Inch by inch, the Negro was fairly cooked to death. Every few minutes, fresh leaves were tossed on the funeral until the blaze had passed the Negro's waist. As the flames were eating away his abdomen, a member of the mob stepped forward and saturated the body with gasoline. It was then only a few minutes until the Negro had been reduced to ashes. Even after the flesh had dropped away from his legs and the flames were leaping towards his face, Lowry retained consciousness. Not once did he whimper or beg for mercy. Once or twice he attempted to pick up the hot ashes in his hands and thrust them in his mouth in order to hasten death. And again, and this is on page 204 of Black America. We'll jump right into this depiction of a lynching. The Negro was led to a hickory tree, to which they chained him. After securing him to the tree, a fire was laid. A short distance away, another fire was kindled, and into it was put an iron bar to heat. When the bar became red hot, a member of the mob jabbed it toward the Negro's body. Crazed with fright, the black man grabbed hold of it, and as it was pulled through his hands, the atmosphere was filled with the odor of burning flesh. This was the first time the murderer gave evidence of his will being broken. Scream, and that's how they described him, as a murderer. Again, whether he was proven guilty or not, that was never known. Scream after scream rent the air. As the hot iron was applied to various parts of his body, his yells and cries for mercy could be heard in the town. After torturing the Negro several minutes, one of the masked men poured coal oil on his feet and trousers and applied a match to the pyre. As the flames rose, enveloping the black's body, he begged that he be shot. Yells of derision greeted his request. The angry flames consumed his clothing, and little blue blazes shot upward from his burning hair before he lost consciousness. And also, a correspondent of the Memphis News, Schmidt-Tar, wrote the following description of a lynching which took place in the autumn of 1925. That last one was that was from the Chattanooga Daily Times, Crisis, April 1918. This is an eyewitness testimony. I watched an angry mob chain him to an iron stake. I watched them pile wood around his helpless body. I watched them pour gasoline on this wood, and I watched 3 men set this wood on fire. I stood in a crowd of 600 people as the flames gradually crept nearer and nearer to the helpless Negro. I watched the blaze climb higher and higher, encircling him without mercy. I heard his cry of agony as the flames reached him and set his clothing on fire. Oh God, he shouted. I didn't do it. Have mercy. The blaze leaped higher. The Negro struggled. He kicked the chain loose from his ankles, but it held his waist and neck against the iron post that was becoming red with the intense heat. Have mercy, I didn't do it, he shouted again and again. Soon he became quiet. There was no doubt that he was dead. The flames jumped and leaped above his head. An odor of burning flesh reached my nostrils. I felt suddenly sickened. Through the leaping blaze, I could see the Negro sagging and supported by the chains. With the first odor of the baking flesh, or excuse me, when the first odor of the baking flesh reached the mob, there was a slight stir. Several men moved nervously. "Let's finish it up," someone said. Instantly, about 12 men stepped from the crowd. They piled wood on the fire that was already blazing high. The Negro was dead, but more wood was piled on the flames. They jumped higher and higher. Nothing could be seen now, for the blaze encircled everything. Then the crowd walked away. In the vanguard of the mob, I saw a woman. She seemed to be rather young, yet it is hard to tell about women of her type, strong and healthy, apparently a woman of the country. She walked with a firm, even stride. She was beautiful in a way. The crowd walked slowly away. "I am hungry," someone complained. "Let's get something to eat." That's from the Crisis, November 1925. Horrible, disgusting, outrageous. But that was the historical setting at the turn of the century, in the early decades of the 20th century, in the southern region of the United States. In 1908, the year before Testimonies Volume 9 was published, there is what is called the Dogwood Tree Postcard. This is how low things got. A postcard was circulating with a picture of a hanging on it. The Fort Worth Star-Telegram and the Dallas Morning News carried articles on June 23, 1908 from Hempville, Texas, about a similar incident, or about an incident of a lynching. Under the headline, "Mob Hangs 5 and Shoots Another," the Star-Telegram reported, this is the background for the postcard, 5 Negroes all hanged to one tree was the spectacle that met the gaze of hundreds of spectators on the Hempville and Bronson Road, yesterday, about 1 mile from the courthouse. They were taken from the Hempville jail by a determined mob of about 200 men. 6 of them in all were taken out, and they were the Negroes charged with the murder of Hugh Dean, which occurred at Rock Hill Church near Geneva 2 weeks ago, Saturday night. One of the Negroes taken by the mob tried to escape and was shot, so they hung them. Now, if you Google the Dogwood Tree Postcard, you can actually see a picture of the postcard. It has the actual picture of these poor, unfortunate black men hanging dead. You can see that, and then under it is a poetic statement that captures the mood of the South and the view of white Southerners then. Here's how it reads under the picture on the postcard. "This is only the branch of a dogwood tree, an emblem of white supremacy, a lesson once taught in the pioneer school, that this is a land of white man's rule. The red man once in an early day was told by the whites to mend his way. The Negro now, by eternal grace, must learn to stay in the Negro's place. In the sunny South, the land of the free, let the white supreme forever be. Let this a warning to all Negroes be, or they'll suffer the fate of the dogwood tree." This was a popular lynching postcard poem circulating in 1908. It's horrible. It's disgusting. It's sickening. I'm sure you feel that way too as you've listened to these horrible testimonies of lynchings and the attitude. That was that era. Thank God it's not that way today, but that was that era then. This is the setting in which Ellen White penned her words of caution. Now, I want to shift and discuss the immediate Adventist contexts for the work in the South. So I'm going to back up a little bit and discuss in a nutshell, the history of the work in the South. And in my readings, I just, several doctoral dissertations have been focused on this, and one by an Adventist scholar. This is a dissertation published by Andrews University, or not published, but completed at Andrews University in 2011, Resistance and Accommodation to Racism Among Early Seventh-day Adventist Missionaries in the American South, a case study of relating to oppressive cultural practices in missions. Very helpful, insightful doctoral study by Kessia Renee Bennett. And I like the way she summarizes, in a nutshell, the history of the black work by Adventists. So I'm just going to read several paragraphs here, that because it's such a tight summary, I think it does it well and will set things up as we get into the more literary context of Ellen White's statements. So here's a history then of the black work in the South by Seventh-day Adventists. The first black Seventh-day Adventist congregation was formed in 1886. And the first black Seventh-day Adventist minister, Charles Kinney, was ordained in 1889. But these steps of progress into the black work were rather happenstance, not the result of an intentional and coordinated enterprise to reach blacks with the Adventist message. At the General Conference level, there were animated discussions regarding racial segregation. That's in 1887. And then in 1889, the South was designated District Number 2, with R.M. Kilgore given oversight of the work there. Adventist historian Delbert W. Baker rightly calls the period of 1844 through 1890 the inactive period of black Adventist history. And I should add my own comment here that Delbert Baker has done one of the most definitive studies of the history of the black work. His doctoral dissertation was on that subject, and his many writings thereafter. His son, Benjamin Baker, has as well done a lot of scholarly historical study into this era. That changed in 1891, the beginning of what Baker calls the active period. In that year, Ellen White addressed church leaders at the General Conference session in Battle Creek, Michigan. Her appeal was titled Our Duty to the Colored People, and in it she urgently called for dedicated missionaries to reach blacks with the gospel message. She recognized that the Southern field posed particular challenges in race relations that intensified the difficulty of evangelizing black people. It will always be a difficult matter to deal with the prejudices of the white people in the South and to do missionary work for the colored race, she wrote, or stated rather. Despite the hardship, however, doing this work was not optional. Ellen White said, "Sin rests upon us as a church because we have not made greater effort for the salvation of souls among the colored people." Ellen White also addressed the conclusion that the workers in the South were experiencing regarding segregation, that is, the color line. At the start of her address, she said, "It has been a question to some how far to concede to the prevailing prejudice against the colored people." She responded to this perplexity by developing a theology of equality of all people, referencing Christ's poverty of outward lowliness, and his teaching regarding compassion, his efficacy of the sacrifice for all people, or of his sacrifice for all people, New Testament passages exhorting the tenderest love for between believers, the liberation of the oppressed, Hebrews from Egyptian bondage, and even her own experience in receiving a message from God regarding the brotherhood of all believers. That's an admirable summary of that most important statement, our duty to the colored people. I highly recommend that you go and read that in its entirety in 1891. That has a lot of statements that express themes that run through all of her counsels with regard to the black work. This message was a decisive turning point in the history of the church's black work, according to Baker. It was distributed in manuscript form to church leadership and prominent workers in the South, and later was published as a leaflet. Despite its distribution, the counsel was basically ignored until 1893, when Ellen White's oldest surviving son, Edson, went hunting for it and found it scattered among papers in an office under renovation. Edson had recently experienced a reconversion and desired to serve God in denominational service, and he had already been investigating the possibility of working among the black population. It was this discarded pamphlet that actuated Edson's breakthrough missionary enterprise. With business partner Willow Palmer, Edson built a river steamboat that would serve as living quarters, printing press, and chapel for the small missionary band. The boat Morning Star set out in 1894, and after a long trip, it arrived with its crew in Vicksburg, Mississippi on January 10, 1895. Edson and Palmer were given a small weekly salary of $8 and had been given credentials by the General Conference to serve as missionaries to the black population of the South. They began by meeting with the people in a home prayer circle, then moved to the Mount Zion Baptist Church to hold Bible studies, and soon after began night classes which gave reading lessons and religious instruction. Interest swelled, and soon persecution came as the northern missionaries became too popular and word got out about their peculiar Seventh-day Sabbath keeping. The local churches were then closed to them, but in time the Adventists built their own chapels and the work spread into surrounding Mississippi locations such as Yazoo City, Latonia, Kalmar, and Bliss's Landing. Other missionaries came to join the work in Mississippi and expanded the educational ministry. In 1896, the General Conference opened the doors to Oakwood Industrial School in Huntsville, Alabama, as a training school for black youth. That school now, of course, is Oakwood University. By 1910, Edson White and other missionary companies had established dozens of schools across the South. The medical missionary work was expanding as well, providing home health care, cooking schools, and hygiene training to the local population. This health ministry worked well with the ministry or Mercy Ministries that began operation, including a regularly operating Dorcas Society and even disaster relief. Meanwhile, the black work was gathering momentum throughout the South. Within about 15 years, the number of black Seventh-day Adventists went from about 50 in 1894 to 900 by 1909. So there you have the context of Testimonies, Volume 9, published in 1909. Now let's look at the immediate historical events that elicited a response from Ellen White that would eventually be published in Testimonies, Volume 9. First of all, the threat of violence. Already, I painted to you the very volatile and violent situation you had there in the South. This is the situation. It was at an all-time intensity when Edson sailed or steamed down there in the Morning Star. As early as 1895, Edson felt the shadow of threatened violence for those who had violated the racial etiquette. He wrote, "Here we do not dare accept any entertainment from the colored people, even if they were able to give it. A missionary a little ways from here was taken out by a masked band and shot because he made common with the colored people." So that certainly fits that context, even for a whites to help the black people in any way, to be with them, could endanger their own lives. Then you have a crisis of 1898 to 1899. This is when things really got bad for the Adventist. And Ron Grable, in his book Ellen G. White and Church Relations, published in 1970, that's really the definitive work and is still a very helpful work today. It's not in print, but you can find various copies of it and online versions of it. It's a, to date, the definitive study in this area. All other studies, and even this podcast, will go back and refer to Grable's initial work. It was part of his master's thesis work in this area, and most helpful. So I'm pulling from that as well as some other sources. In 1898, Fred R. Rogers joined Edson in founding the Southern Missionary Society and opened a school for blacks in Yazoo City, Mississippi. Due to the volatile situation of white teachers teaching blacks, a crisis emerged, and in December of that year, he wrote to Edson, "Satan is loosed here. We are in trouble. Today at 1:30 p.m., two men rode up to the chapel where we are holding school and called me out and asked my name and told me this business must stop. We went to the river last night to sink the boat Morning Star, but could not find it. It will never land here again, so beware." Well, Brother White, we are resting in the Lord and have left the case to Him. That is about the time. That's right, in December of 1898. Edson responded in a piece in the Gospel Herald that his people had nothing to do with politics, because this seemed to be the issue that they were saying they were getting involved with that. And of course, politics in this context meant race relations. and follow up from the Civil War and Reconstruction. The workers under attack had done nothing to challenge the racial customs and beliefs of the white people, except that they were educating the Negroes, and that in and of itself brought them into great danger. That was 1898. It got worse in 1899 when another dangerous situation erupted. On May 25, 1899, Edson reported to his mother in a letter, 2 weeks ago tonight, a mob of about 25 white men came to our church at Calmer at about midnight. They brought out Brother Stevenson, our worker, and then looted the church, burning books, maps, charts, etc. They hunted for Brother Casey, our leading colored brother of that place, but he had escaped in time, so they did not reach him. They then went to the house of Brother Oven, called out, and whipped him with a cowhide. I think they would have killed him if it had not been for a friendly white man who ordered them to stop whipping after they had struck a few blows. They did not pay attention to him at first, but he drew his revolver and said the next man who struck a blow would hear from him, and then they stopped. During this time, they shot at Brother Oven's wife and struck her in the leg, but did not hurt her seriously. They took Brother Stevenson to the nearest railway station, put him on cars, and set him out of the country. They posted notice on our church forbidding me to return and forbidding the steamer Morning Star to land between Yazoo City and Vicksburg. The whole difficulty arose from our efforts to aid the colored people. We had given them clothing, were in need, and food to those who were hungry, and taught them some better ideas about farming, introducing different seeds such as peanuts and beans, etc., that bring a high price. And this the whites would not stand. And that's Edson to Ellen White, May 23, 1899. Well, this letter, descriptions of these challenges, these crises, this is what prompted Ellen White to respond. A few days after receiving Edson's letter from Mississippi, she wrote on June 5, 1899, to A.F. Ballinger that it is the prejudice of the whites against the black race that makes this field hard, very hard. The whites who have oppressed the colored people still have the same spirit. They did not lose it, although they were conquered in war. They are determined to make it appear that the blacks were better off in slavery than since they were set free. You see how she captures the situation that historians describe today? This is a primary source of someone who was alive during that time and witnessing the events. Any provocation from blacks is met with the greatest cruelty. The field is one that needs to be worked with the greatest discretion. See, this is the sentiment behind the statements we are discussing in this episode. Again, I read, the field is one that needs to be worked with the greatest discretion. And let me actually go back to the previous sentence before that. Any provocation from the blacks is met with the greatest cruelty. Any mingling of white people with the colored people, as in sleeping in their houses or showing them friendship, as would be shown by the whites to those of their own color, is exasperating to the white people of the South. The white people will stir up the blacks by telling them all kinds of stories, and the blacks who can lie, even when it is for their interest to speak the truth, will stir up the whites with falsehoods. And the whites who want an occasion will seize upon any pretext for taking revenge, even upon those of their own color who are presenting the truth. This is the danger. As far as possible, everything that will stir up the race prejudice of the white people should be avoided. There is danger of closing the door so that our white laborers will not be able to work in some places in the South. That was the concern. Now, this is the immediate context for the statement under contention in Testimonies, Volume 9, page 214. It reads, the colored people should not urge that they be placed on any equality with the white people. Already, friends, I'm sure the historical background information I've already given brings great clarity to this statement, but we're not finished. I want to continue clarifying it. So here's the context of that sentence. In the paragraph, The relation of the two races has been a matter hard to deal with, and I fear that it will ever remain a most perplexing problem. So far as possible, everything that would stir up the race prejudice of the white people should be avoided. There is danger of closing the door so that our white laborers will not be able to work in some places in the South. Now, you will notice a similarity with the similar statement to Ballinger I just read in 1899. Remember that Testimonies Volume 9 is assembled from earlier Ellen White documents, letters, manuscripts, obviously this letter to Ballinger, that were written during the decade prior to 1908. So the statement under scrutiny, the colored people should not urge that they be placed on an equality with white people, was written 3 times by Ellen White. A lot of people don't know that. 3 times she wrote that statement. By constructing the historical setting, Ron Grable believes that the first time was in response to the crisis of events in 1898 to 1999 that Edson had reported to her. We just read that earlier. In 1903, she wrote to Edson and his wife, "I think I have already written that the colored people should not urge that they be placed on an equality with the white people." So this would have been the second time. Thus, the first time this sentence was uttered was in 1899. The second in 1903, the third in 1909 in Testimonies Volume 9. So we know at least it was written 2 times, if not that third time in 1899. In each instance, though, the context is the same. Use wisdom and prudence and don't excite the prejudice of the white people by agitating the color line. This had nothing to do with Ellen White making a racist statement about the inferiority of the blacks. That was not the point at all. She believed that all were equal. The principle of the equality of all human beings still runs through like a golden thread in these statements. It's the context that she is dealing with. Now, there's an interesting explanatory statement published in 1899 about this same time that I believe clarifies just what she meant when she said that the colored people should not urge that they be placed on an equality with white people. And it's published, it's a part of a letter in 1899. It's published in Manuscript Releases, Volume 4, on page 13, where she wrote, "If you would make the Southern whites and the colored people your friends, you must meet them where they are. Not act as they act, to sin as they sin, but to present the truth to them in your daily life. This people must be taught as you would teach children their alphabet. The truth must be brought before them by presenting to them the lessons of Christ in their simplicity." And she's not demeaning their intelligence. It's just that they didn't know how to read or write. They needed to be taught in a most basic way, because there are numerous times where she affirms the intelligence of many black people. But the next sentence reads, "By unwise words, the colored people will be led to think that they can defy their oppressors. Therefore, we must avoid stirring up their excitable natures. Speak no word that will prejudice the Negroes against the whites." Satan is seeking for opportunities to work these ignorant, passionate people, or ignorant, passionate colored people, by causing them to misunderstand the motives of the white people in laboring for them. Let no spirit of resistance be encouraged. Teach the people to conform in all things to the laws of their state, when they can do so without conflicting with the law of God. Counsel needs to be very guardedly given, for unless you are wise as serpents and as harmless as doves, your way will be hedged. That's actually from Manuscript 118, 1899, page 1 through 3. That's the work in the South. So notice the wisdom here. By unwise words, the colored people will be led to think that they can defy their oppressors. And for the colored people to urge that they be placed on an equality with white people, that would certainly be a way of defying their oppressors. That's what she's talking about. Don't defy your oppressors. Why? That would bring torture, death, destruction. great common sense advice in a very dangerous, volatile situation. They didn't want the work of the gospel to close in the South, number one. And number two, they did not want to bring harm upon the black people. This was wise counsel. This is the background to the statement the colored people should not urge that they be placed on an equality with white people. It's not a racist statement. This is a wise piece of advice in how to avoid danger and death and even torture. Now, with this historical background information, let's walk through section 6 in Testimonies, volume 9. I want to highlight several statements, again, giving the literary context for this statement that Ellen White makes, and I'll address some other controversial statements as well. A theme that runs through this is the theme of caution. We've already seen the historical setting. White people in the South needed to exercise caution, especially missionaries, for many of the churches, let alone the Adventist. So here is the section. Again, this is in that section 6 in Testimonies, volume 9. The first division is a call for colored laborers. Here's some selected statements. Opportunities are continually presenting themselves in the southern United States, and many wise Christian colored men will be called to work. But for several reasons, white men must be chosen as leaders. Oops, that sounds racist, doesn't it? But when you look at the situation, the black people, they were just learning these things. There was no leaders among them yet. Please notice the next sentence. We are all members of one body and are complete only in Christ Jesus, who will uplift his people from the low level to which sin has degraded them and place them where they shall be acknowledged in the heavenly courts as laborers together with God. There is work to be done in many hard places, and out of these hard places, bright laborers are to come. Let the work be managed so that colored laborers will be educated to work for their own race. Among the Negro race, there are many who have talent and ability. So the appointing of white leaders in Ellen White's mind was only temporary until the talent and ability in the black race rose to the occasion, and then they could direct the work themselves. So let us search out these men, she said, these men and women, and teach them how to engage in the work of saving souls. God will cooperate with them and give them the victory. And indeed, friends, you read early Adventist history during this period, they did find black leaders. They emerged and made a significant contribution as the work continued to grow and flourish, in spite of the obstacles of prejudice. Another division, proclaiming the truth where there is race antagonism. Ellen White wrote, I am heavily burdened for the work among the colored people. The gospel is to be presented to the downtrodden Negro race. But great caution will have to be shown in the efforts put forth for the uplifting of this people. Among the white people in many places, there exists a strong prejudice against the Negro race. We may desire to ignore this prejudice, but we cannot do it. If we were to act as if this prejudice did not exist, we could not get the light before the white people. We must meet the situation as it is and deal with it wisely and intelligently. This is the approach Ellen White takes. This is the context for these statements. They must be read in light of these other wise statements. That was page 204, by the way. One of the difficulties attending the work, she wrote, is that many of the white people living where the colored people are numerous are not willing that special effort should be put forth to uplift them. When they see schools established for them, when they see them being taught to be self-supporting, to follow trades, to provide themselves with comfortable homes instead of continuing to live in hovels, they see the possibility that selfish plans will be interfered with, that they will no longer be able to hire the Negro for a mere pittance, and their enmity is aroused. They feel that they are injured and abused. Some act as if slavery had never been abolished. Here, Ellen White captures the historical situation with precision. According to historians Stuart E. Tolney and Amy Kate Bailey in their classic scholarly work, Lynched, The Victims of Southern Mob Violence, published in 2015, they claim that many lynchings can be traced to Black people who had achieved some financial means for themselves. They demonstrate this, I should say, in their work. They were lynched as an example and message to other Blacks that they were to stay in their place. Then Ellen White made this comment on page 205. As time advances and opposition strengthens, circumstances warn us that discretion is the better part of valor. Interesting. Valor is to be brave and to stand up against obstacles. She certainly advocated valor during the pre-Civil War era when she said, resist the fugitive slave law, don't obey it. In the 1850s, late 1850s, she made that statement. But here she's saying discretion. This is not the time to stand up and have valor. We need to be wise as serpents, harmless as doves, a phrase she repeated often. Notice she said, as time advances, opposition strengthens. That is precisely what was happening during this period, and I captured some of that in my earlier statements of the historical setting by the historians and our horrible depictions of lynchings. She went on to say, in regard to white people and colored people worshiping in the same building, now this gets controversial if it's not understood in its historical setting. In regard to white people and colored people worshiping in the same building, this cannot be followed as a general custom with profit to either party, especially in the South. Why? Well, Edson was almost lynched for bringing Blacks and whites into the same building to worship. She went on to say, let the colored believers be provided with neat, tasteful houses of worship. Let them be shown that this is done not to exclude them from worshiping with white people because they are Black, but in order that the progress of the truth may be advanced. Let them understand that this plan is to be followed until the Lord shows us a better way. That's pages 206 to 207 in Testimonies, Volume 9. That phrase, until the Lord shows us a better way, that was the watchword for this period. Now is a time to exercise great caution and work with the situation, work under the radar. Don't agitate the color line until the Lord shows us a better way. Don't encourage the Black people to rise up and be on an equality with the whites. No. Wait until the Lord shows us a better way. And the better way, of course, would be to overcome racial prejudice. And that way would eventually come in our nation, as we all know, thankfully. But at this point, they weren't sure what to do. So they had to wait for the Lord to show them a better way. And the better way, or at least the way they chose at the time, was to work under the radar. Next, she said, let the work be done in a way that will not arouse prejudice, which would close doors now open for the entrance of the truth. Page 209. He who is closely connected with Christ is lifted above the prejudice of color and caste. His faith takes hold of eternal realities. That's on page 209. This is a significant statement in the midst of this discussion of exercising caution and not agitating the color line. Notice she says, those connected with Christ are lifted above the prejudice of color or caste. Now, this is significant because she will repeat this statement later on in all of these counsels. And I'll show you the significance of that when I get to it. But already, this is the context. Again, this is the principle. Principle number one I mentioned at the beginning of this episode, that all humans, Black and white, are equal in creation and redemption. And God's people, Christian people, should be lifted above the prejudice of caste or color. That's page 209. She went on, we are not to agitate the color line question and thus arouse prejudice and bring about a crisis. You may think she's repeating herself, but she's emphasizing this. This is a theme through this. And yet it does not diminish her principles of all humans being equal. We are not to be in haste to define the exact course to be pursued in the future regarding the relation to be maintained between white people and colored people. The truth for this time is to be proclaimed before thousands of people in the southern states. The way is to be cleared as far as possible of all obstruction. Let the gospel message be given to the people. Let white and colored people be labored for in separate, distinct lines, and let the Lord take care of the rest. And that was the approach. Until the Lord shows a better way, let the colored people be labored for in separate, distinct lines, and let the Lord take care of the rest. Now, this leads me to the major section here entitled The Color Line in section 6 of Testimonies, volume 9. This is where she makes that statement. And here is its context. That statement about the colored people should not urge that they be on the same level with the whites. I'm paraphrasing it, but that's the statement. Here is the immediate section in which it is in. She wrote, I have some things to say in regard to the colored people of the southern states of America and the relation that we should sustain to them. So long were they under the curse of slavery that it is a difficult problem to know how they should be treated. We are to avoid entering into contention over the problem of the color line. If this question is much agitated, difficulties will arise that will consume much precious time to adjust. We cannot lay down a definite time to be allowed in dealing with this subject. So again, there is that warning. It is Satan's plan to call minds to the study of the color line. If his suggestions are heeded, there will be diversity of opinion and great confusion. No one is capable of clearly defining the proper position of the colored people. Now, that sentence right there is often lifted out of its context like the other and made to claim Ellen White is a racist. No one is capable of clearly defining the proper position of the colored people. When in today's world, well, that's of course that's we know the proper position of black people. They're equal with whites. We're all one. We're all one nation, right? That statement seems to go against that, but you've got to read it in this situation, in this historical setting. She probably, when she says theories and so forth, in fact, the next sentence reads, men may advance theories, but I assure you that it will not do for us to follow human theories. So far as possible, the color line question should be allowed to rest. She's probably referring to some of the debates in the church about that. John Harvey Kellogg had been influenced by someone who had said we should defy the whites about the situation. Obviously, Ellen White was against that, but also in the larger historical setting, she could have been referring to Booker T. Washington in his famous Atlanta Compromise in 1895, where he basically won the applause of both, especially of the whites, when he said that the blacks basically should stay submissive to the whites. But W.E.B. Du Bois, one of the founders of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, in 1909, he took a different position and said we should we should stand up and fight for our rights. So these theories, Ellen White wanted her people to stay away from them and find a balance, find the right work. No one is capable of clearly defining the proper position of the colored people. It really was the colored people problem referred to by some of the historians earlier. Just what to do about it. It was a situation that anybody in the South was plagued with, white or black. And with regard to the work, the missionary work by Adventists in the South, nobody had an answer at this time. It would take years for this Jim Crow nightmare to get over. So she went on to say, the colored people should not urge, Here's that statement. Now we have the immediate setting for it. The colored people should not urge that they be placed on an equality with the white people. Again, we saw that they shouldn't be encouraged to defy the situation in the South, to defy their white oppressors. Blacks who did that received severe punishment. I'm going to read to you one more depiction of a lynching. In many ways, this is the worst of all. I'm again quoting from Litwack in his book, Trouble in Mind, page 288 and 289. The brutalities meted out in these years, and these are the years that we're discussing here in which Ellen White wrote these words. The brutalities meted out in these years often exceeded the most vivid of imaginations. After learning of the lynching of her husband, Mary Turner, in her 8th month of pregnancy, vowed to find those responsible, swear out warrants against them, and have them punished in the courts. For making such a threat, a mob of several hundred men and women determined to teach her a lesson. After tying her ankles together, they hung her from a tree, head downward. Dousing her clothes with gasoline, they burned them from her body. While she was still alive, someone used a knife ordinarily reserved for splitting hogs to cut open the woman's abdomen. The infant fell prematurely from her womb to the ground and cried briefly, whereupon a member of this Valdosta, Georgia mob crushed the baby's head beneath his heel. Hundreds of bullets were then fired into Mary Turner's body, completing the work of the mob. Awful. Awful. That's a tragic example of one woman who defied her oppressors. This is the wisdom behind Ellen White's statements. The colored people should not urge that they be placed on an equality with the white people. When you look at it in this historical setting, it makes perfect sense. It's wise counsel. It's not racist counsel at all. It's wise counsel for this situation. And again, continuing after that sentence in the paragraph that it is in, the relation of the two races has been a matter hard to deal with, and I fear that it will ever remain a most perplexing problem. So far as possible, and this is echoing the earlier letter to Ballinger in 1899, so far as possible, everything that would stir up the race prejudice of the white people should be avoided. There is danger of closing the door so that our white laborers will not be able to work in some places in the South. Friends, this is the literary and historical setting that you never hear from the critics. When they take these statements, isolated sentences, and then claim Ellen White was a racist. They never read them, even in this paragraph, which says a lot about it, let alone all the background information I've given you so far. Let's continue. And this is all in that section, the color line. I know that if we attempt to meet the ideas and preferences of some of the colored people, we shall find our way blocked completely. And apparently, a number of the black people were probably following the ideas of W.E.B. Du Bois, who was an intelligent black man who had done advanced studies and degrees. But he advocated standing up and resisting. And so in this setting, Ellen White is encouraging them not to do that, encouraging the workers to suggest a better way to the black people. Again, I know that if we attempt to meet the ideas and preferences of some of the colored people, we shall find our way blocked completely. The work of proclaiming the truth for this time is not to be hindered by an effort to adjust the position of the Negro race. Again, that's not racist, see? That statement is often lifted out of its context. It's not racist, it's just considering the situation. Because if we attempt to adjust their position, we could bring great wrath upon ourselves and especially upon them. Should we attempt to do this, we should find that barriers like mountains would be raised to hinder the work that God desires to have done. If we move quietly, judiciously, laboring in the way that God has marked out, both white and colored people will be benefited by our labors. The time has not come for us to work as if there were no prejudice. Christ said, "Be ye therefore wise as serpents and harmless as doves," Matthew 10:16. You can see this echoes of the earlier writings that I've shared before, written years before, where they're coming together right here. This counsel makes perfect sense. And they followed this. They stayed under the radar, and the work continued to grow. There was no major crisis. But let me continue here. If you see that by doing certain things, and you might recognize this from an earlier document, if you see that by doing certain things which you have a perfect right to do, you hinder the advancement of God's work, refrain from doing those things. Do nothing that will cause the minds of others against the truth. There is a world to save, and we shall gain nothing by cutting loose from those we are trying to help. All things may be lawful, but all things are not expedient. Echoing Paul again there. Wisdom, some right things done at the wrong time can be harmful. That's the basic idea. And while racism is wrong, prejudice is wrong, in this setting, it's not wise to fight it. It's not wise to stand up and defy it. It's to work around it, through it, under it, and wait until things change. The next paragraph begins, "The wise course is the best." As laborers together with God, we are to work in the way that will enable us to accomplish the most for Him. Let none go to extremes. We need wisdom from above, for we have a difficult problem to solve. If rash moves are made now, great mischief will be done. Oh, how true that was. We are to do as the Spirit of the Lord shall dictate and agitate the subject of the color line as little as possible. And wisely, this is what they did. Edson and those he had worked with, he had trained, they followed this counsel. And thereafter, there was not a major crisis again. The Adventists were able to work with the blacks and train indigenous black leaders among them, and the work grew and prospered because of that. And today, there is a huge presence of Black Seventh-day Adventists in the southern region of the United States of America. And that is because they wisely followed this counsel and enabled them to really help Black people and bring them to Christ and minister to them. And of course, as America changed, this changed a lot of things in the way they would work as well. We come to the last section here, entitled Consideration for Colored Laborers. It begins this way. The religion of the the religion of the Bible recognizes no caste or color. It ignores rank, wealth, worldly honor. God estimates men as men. With Him, character decides their worth. Does that sound like a racist? Heavens no. This is the theme that runs through all of section 6 in Testimonies, volume 9. Twice she mentions caste and color. The next sentence, she says, we are to recognize the Spirit of Christ in whomsoever it is revealed. No one need be ashamed to speak with an honest black man in any place or to shake him by the hand. He who is living in the atmosphere in which Christ lives will be taught of God and will learn to put his estimate on all men. That's page 223 in Testimonies, volume 9. What wonderful counsel. You never hear these statements by the critics. They somehow seem to miss these statements. The YouTube channels and the writings that lift these statements out of their context. It's the most unfair treatment of any writings I've ever seen. It's a hermeneutic in and of itself by critics of Ellen White. Further on the page, she wrote, we cannot expect that, In all things, they, that is the black people, will be as firm and clear in their ideas of morality. Now, that statement is often lifted out of its context as well. But the background in a General Conference bulletin, April 14, 1903, Ellen White said, "You say that the colored people are depraved and wicked," speaking of the white audience, Adventist she was speaking to. "You say that the colored people are depraved and wicked, that their standard of morality is very low. Who made them wicked? Who spoiled their morals? I want you to think of this and of the burden that rests upon the white people to help the colored people." In other words, she is not saying that black people have some inherent, intrinsic low morality because they're black. That is not what she's saying at all. What she's saying is that the conditions that they were under, the conditions forced upon them by the white people when they were in slavery, and even in this new form of slavery, in the Jim Crow years, it was hard for them to develop morality. And she even mentions in another place that they learned low morality from the whites who slept with black women and impregnated them. And many children were from this union during the Civil War years and after. That's the background behind this statement. We cannot expect that in all things they will be as firm and clear in their ideas of morality. In other words, because of the conditions that they've under. The point was they need to be taught. They can develop principles of morality. The next sentence is most interesting. Let me read the two sentences together. "We cannot expect that in all things they will be as firm and clear in their ideas of morality. Were Christ on earth today, he would teach the Negro race in a way that would surprise us." Wow. How interesting is that? We just need to read Ellen White in context. That's the way to be fair. When you hear these writings in their historical and literary context, there's no way you can read any racism into it at all. So let me again point out this statement here on page 223. "The religion of the Bible recognizes no caste or color." This is like a bookend to the earlier statement on page 209, where she says, "He who is closely connected with Christ is lifted above the prejudice of color and caste." There she says color and caste. Here she has caste and color. It's almost like bookends. And that's the framework for these statements that are often misunderstood. This is that principle that I mentioned earlier, that important foundational principle that all human beings, black and white, are one in Christ, in creation, in redemption. They are all equal and they were all free. And Christians should have no caste, experience no caste. The Bible recognizes no caste or color. Those who walk with Christ are lifted above the prejudice of color and caste. That's page 209 and page 223. Testimonies, volume 9. That's the framework for this whole discussion. So one cannot simply ignore this context and make a racist out of Ellen White. To do so is to blatantly ignore the historical circumstance of this period in American history. In fact, to ignore the setting of these statements is to ignore an important part of American history, a sad part of American history, a tragic part of American history, which deserves more attention and more discussion in history textbooks and discussions. It is even unfair to blacks to ignore the historical setting of the suffocating blanket of Jim Crow that was the immediate setting for Ellen White's statements. She was not speaking to the latter 20th or 21st century situation. Neither was she addressing the fundamental nature of black people, their physical, mental, or spiritual qualities. That was not the point. She had already been crystal clear on this matter that all human beings are equal before God, black and white, in creation and in redemption. Here we see the danger of the larger historical context in America during this time, as well as the immediate danger threatening Edson's work. This is the historical context that elicited Ellen White's controversial words. But when seen in the literary and historical context, which I have outlined in this episode, her words are not racist at all. In fact, to the contrary, her words are healing. If you read all of Ellen White's statements about the races and the black work, read them collectively, they actually, I would submit, can be a healing agent to the tensions we experience today. So again, her words are not racist at all. Rather, they harmonize with her basic guiding principles of dealing with the black work in the South. The two principles I enunciated at the beginning. Number one, all human beings, black or white, are precious and equal in God's sight. And number two, Seventh-day Adventist workers in the South should do nothing to agitate the color line and excite the prejudice of the whites against the blacks or against the Adventists. They should work undercover, under the radar, and that they did. And because of that, the work grew and flourished in the southern region of the United States. And we have a huge population of black Seventh-day Adventists there today because they followed this wise counsel. And I guarantee you, black Seventh-day Adventists in the South, they understand these statements. They especially are the experts in understanding these statements. And they know Ellen White is their friend, not a racist. So the critics of Ellen White have no case whatsoever in using these statements to make a racist out of Ellen White. That is the most unfair treatment of her writings anybody could do. Now, I've been hard on the critics, but let's turn the table and address briefly how Seventh-day Adventist church leaders ignored the historical and literary setting of these statements as well. And they did it to promote segregation. As you look in the early decades of the Adventist work, sadly, black Seventh-day Adventists, they were segregated in Adventist institutions. They couldn't even go and eat in the Review and Herald cafeteria. This is an unfortunate part of Adventist history. Leaders, white leaders, kept control of the black work, and they used some of these controversial statements that critics use to make a racist out of Ellen White. They used them to support they used them to support white leadership and white dominance over the black work, and to support segregation in the early decades of the 20th century. Thank the Lord that would change. But these leaders also took those statements out of their historical context. They didn't read all the other statements Ellen White made, even in the context of Testimonies, Volume 9, about the equality of all human beings and about Christians who should not have any caste or prejudice among them or segregation. When Ellen White talked about segregation during this time, it fit the context. But these workers used that years later for their advantage. That's not Ellen White's fault that critics and Adventist leaders during that era misinterpreted her. She was very clear. When you read her in context, she is crystal clear, but others have taken them out of context. That is most unfortunate, and I don't have time. I've gone long enough to discuss that situation in the church. That would be another episode, of course, where church leaders took those statements out of context and used them for their own advantage. So let's conclude. The heart of the issue is interpretation or misinterpretation. Taking certain statements and testimonies, Volume 9, as setting forth divine principles when in fact they were temporary, expedient measures meant to deal with a difficult, historically bound situation. These statements have been taken out of context by both critics today and church leaders in the early decades of the 20th century. Ellen White herself stood by her guiding principles about race relations and maintained those principles of equality, even in her application of them to a difficult situation. This failure to honor the literary and historical setting of these statements has resulted in disastrous results both in the way critics used them to discredit Ellen White and in the way church leaders used them to maintain segregation in the church. As such, applying correct and fair principles of interpretation to Ellen White's writings is imperative in achieving an accurate understanding of her message. So again, I assert, based on my historical analysis and literary analysis, Ellen White was not racist in any way, shape, or form. To the contrary, her counsels, when understood holistically, can be a healing agent to racial tensions today. Well, friends, I've gone a long time, but this was an important one, such an important one. Thanks so much for listening. I'll continue my series on Ellen White and racism in my next episode, where I'll deal with that controversial statement with regard to amalgamation of man and beast. Until then, see you next time.